Good afternoon and a warm, if virtual, welcome to York University and the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. My name is Ravi DeCosta and I'm the Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Studies in the faculty. I'd like to begin today with our land acknowledgement and note that as this event is virtual, this land acknowledgement won't be appropriate for everyone, and so I invite you to think about the territories that you're joining us from today. We recognise that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University's campuses are located, and that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronta has been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Well, thank you all for joining us today for the 2021 John Eleen Annual Lecture in Global Labour. And I want to begin by thanking Anne Thompson again for your continued and steadfast support for this event and to the university. We're very grateful. This lecture also closes the first day of this year's Graduate Student Symposium, Critical Conversations in Work and Labour. The lecture and the symposium are very important events for the Global Labour Research Centre and also for our faculty, which combines the studies of social sciences and humanities with some of the professions, human resource management, IT, and social work. These events really show what is possible when you bring these kinds of studies and approaches together into conversation. For these 3 days, the symposium brings together engaged young scholars, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and early career researchers, all of whom are taking critical approaches to the issues of work and labour, and doing so from many disciplines, from many programs here at York and many other institutions, including quite a few other countries. So I welcome you all and commend the extraordinary range of topics and approaches that you're taking. And if anyone here hasn't had a chance to look at the program, I urge you to do so. The symposium is the result of the creativity and commitment of the organising committee, and I want to especially acknowledge those who've put that together, most of whom are graduate students. I also want to acknowledge my colleagues, Luann Good-Gingrich and Harsha, the Director and Coordinator of the Global Labour Research Centre, for making the centre a place where these kinds of events are possible. And finally, I want to welcome to the university and thank tonight's speaker, Harsha, who will shortly be giving the 2021 John Eleen Annual Lecture in Global Labour. My colleagues will be introducing you properly, but I'd like to say we're delighted that you're able to be this year's lecturer and look forward very much to your remarks. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Ravi. I appreciate you opening this event. We are indeed very pleased to welcome you to the GLRC's 4th John Eleen Annual Lecture in Global Labour. And thanks for coming. I want to say a few words first about the GLRC and what we do. I'm the director of the center, and I also want to introduce Harsha, the coordinator of the GLRC. You've all corresponded with her in one way or another. She's the person behind the GLRC email address, the registration link for this and all other GLRC events, and has been central in planning this event as well. Without exaggeration, Harsha keeps the GLRC running, and I'm very appreciative for your dedicated work. We're an interdisciplinary scholarly community of researchers, students, and community partners, and we engage in the study of work, employment, and labor in changing social, economic, political, and environmental contexts. We host research projects and visiting researchers, and we work with unions and workers' organizations to both better understand the changing world of work and support progressive social change. We also host a seminar series throughout the academic year that brings together researchers and practitioners from across various sectors, disciplines, and regions. So you might watch for notice of those events. And we organized the annual Graduate Student Symposium, to which Ravi referred. That began this morning, and it runs through to Saturday, October 16th. This afternoon's event is the official launch of the Graduate Student Symposium, which is entitled Critical Conversations in Work and Labor. This year, since we're staying in the virtual world, our symposium is again international, and we will hear from presenters from across Canada and from Italy, Austria, Hong Kong, India, and Brazil. And I want to take a minute to name each member of our student planning committee: Brent Troy, Chuck Ming Sang, Ninjira Jefford, Leah McGrath Reynolds, and Shruti Kalyanaraman. They've put together a diverse, stimulating, and relevant program of 11 panels over the course of 3 days. And I hope you check it out. Harsha has put the link to the program in the chat box so you can find it there. Before we begin the lecture, I'd also like to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsors for this event: the Ontario Federation of Labour, Unifor, LiUNA Ontario Provincial District Council, the Cavaluzzo Labor and Employment Law Firm, and Goldblatt Partners. The symposium is generously supported by York University, and specifically, and I will name all the departments and research units to give them their due credit: the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, the Vice President Research and Innovation, the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, Osgoode Hall Law School, the Center for Refugee Studies, the Center for Feminist Research, the Department of Politics, and the School of Human Resources Management, and also at McMaster University, the School of Labor Studies. We're very grateful for this support that we've received. I'll now turn to Anne Thompson. Anne is the wife of the late John Eleen, and her generous donations, as Ravi said, make it possible for the GLRC to host this annual lecture. And Anne, we're so grateful to you for this support and your support for the GLRC more generally. Anne is going to say a little bit about the history and the importance of the John Eleen Lecture in Global Labor. And we're so pleased that you've joined us today, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Luann. Yes, thank you. It is a privilege to be here. And just to give you a little glimpse to the life of my late husband, John. He was a great guy, very, very intelligent, and physically a very strong person. And we had a great 19.5 years of marriage. So in 1929, John was only 7 when the Eleen family emigrated to Canada and settled to farm in Glenella, which is a small town in rural Manitoba. So at that time, the Great Depression was still in progress and life was pretty tough. Due to illness, the family was held back in Halifax and had no way of communicating with their friends in Glenella who were already living there. So arriving by train in the middle of the night, they literally spent their first night sleeping in a haystack. Pioneer life, as I said, was during the Depression was very hard, but they made a great life for themselves. He attended a one-room school where he learned English very quickly. He had an inquiring mind, a great intellect. A love of learning, reading, and classical music was instilled in him, and that remained with him throughout his long life. John grew up with a desire to improve his knowledge and skills, and he helped to support his parents and 3 siblings in many different ways. He joined the RCAF in 1941, became a leading flight mechanic. And one of the requirements was to take a flight in an aircraft that you had actually serviced. So believe me, it was a great incentive to do the job correctly the first time. Although he signed up to go to the Far East, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war, so he never was overseas. After the war, he attended Winnipeg University and then moved to Toronto, where he had a varied career as a union organizer with the UE, fundraiser for the Canadian Cancer Society, until he came face to face with the director whose organization he had tried to unionize, and very quickly became unemployed. He was hired as a research assistant in cancer research at Sick Kids, and then later he was approached by the federal government of the time to work in Ottawa, but decided he didn't want to be an eminence grise in the basement corridors of power. It was at that time the Ontario Federation of Labour recruited him to the position of research director, a position he held for the next 23 years until his retirement. He was totally committed to labour activism, a fierce advocate for and a defender of workers' rights, a passion that lasted a lifetime. He worked tirelessly for the NDP in every election until his health deteriorated and he was no longer able to do that. He walked in the Labour Day parade every year, as I did, and he felt that if the Toronto Star didn't give it sufficient press coverage while he was writing to the editor right, left and centre. He was a prolific reader and writer whose archives include 2 short books, Poverty Amidst Plenty and Plant Shutdown, which was the impact on the workers and the community when a plant is shut down. That's the main employer for that particular community. He wrote many position papers to the government on topics like pension reform, mandatory retirement, injunctions having no place in collective bargaining. He wrote op-ed opinions in the Toronto Star and the Globe, and an abundance of diverse articles in the Labour, Socialist, and the Ukrainian Heritage print media, and he continued to publish articles well into his 80s. For the last 7 years of his life, John required supplemental oxygen on a 24/7 basis, but even that did not slow him down. For 6.5 of those years, he attended Glendon Fitness 3 times a week, pulling an oxygen cylinder behind him. The students told him that he was truly an inspiration to them to keep working out to overcome the stress of assignment deadlines and so on. And Mr. Eleen, if you can be so committed to exercise while needing oxygen, we have no excuse. John died peacefully at home in 2015, 1 week after his 90th birthday, and his Labour books were accepted by the York GLRC and his papers went to the Ontario Archives. I actually have 2 more books that you have an interest in, so I should get them up to you. In finishing, I'd just like to read a brief portion of an article that he wrote for a conference on the Canadian Society for Ukrainian Labour Research. And it's entitled, Some Notable Ukrainian Canadians in the Trade Union Struggles in Ontario. On page 22, he writes, working people will always have to fight to protect their human rights and struggle for social justice and an equitable society. They will draw inspiration, courage, and a sense of community from those who have passed before them. The struggles are as valid and urgent today as it ever was. So that's John in a little nutshell. He was a much more complex person than those few pages would tell. And but I know he would be truly, truly honored to know that there is a memorial lecture in his name at the York GLRC. He would be truly, truly appreciative and very, very impressed. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Anne. Yeah, I'm so pleased that you were able to join us today, and I hope you enjoy the remainder of the event.
Thank you.
I'm also very pleased to introduce our moderator and respondent for today's lecture. Dr. Angele Alook is an assistant professor in the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at York University. As a member of Big Stone Cree Nation in Treaty 8 territory, her research has mainly focused on the political economy of oil and gas in Alberta. She specializes in Indigenous feminisms, life course approaches, Indigenous research methodologies, cultural identity, and the sociology of family and work. She's a co-investigator on the SSHRC partnership grant called Corporate Mapping Project, where she completed research with the Parkland Institute on Indigenous experiences in Alberta's oil industry and its gendered impact on working families. Angele is a member of the Just Powers research team, a SSHRC-funded insight grant. Angele will introduce our esteemed guest speaker today and will offer a response and exchange with Harsha following the keynote address before opening it up to questions from the audience. So Angele, I turn the floor over to you.
Hi. just clicked on the wrong thing on my screen. I also should mention that to reintroduce myself, part of my research has been working in the labor movement as a labor researcher. So I feel like I have a lot in common with John, and so it's a great honor to be here today. Yeah, I just wanted to say that as well. So it's also a great honor to be here introducing Harsha Walia. I've followed her research and her career in, and I use some of her readings in my class. So it's a great honor to be here. So Harsha Walia is an activist and writer based in Vancouver, British Columbia. She is known for her organizing work with No One is Illegal, the February 14th Women's Memorial March Committee, and the Downtown East Side Women's Center, and several downtown East Side housing justice coalitions. Walia has been active in migrant justice, Indigenous solidarity, feminist, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist movements for over a decade. Walia is the author of Border and Rule, Global Migration, Capitalism, and the Rise of Racist Nationalism, which just came out this year in 2021. She's also the author of Undoing Border Imperialism from 2013, and that's actually the book I use in my class. And she's also the co-author of Red Women Rising, Indigenous Women's Survivors in Vancouver's Downtown East Side, a report from 2019, which is a really great report as well. It really uses the voices of Indigenous women survivors. She's also the author of Never Home, Legislating Discrimination in Canadian Immigration from 2015. So I think we can now have Harsha speak.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. Thank you to everyone who's been involved in organizing, and it's such an honor to be here in the memory of John. And just really thank you everyone for your work in bringing this together. And I know virtual spaces are harder to convene than they look. So just much appreciation for everyone who's been involved in all of the events that are happening. I want to say that the territories that I'm on are the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Nations. I'm on the lands, the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples and nations. And it's impossible to talk about and think about immigration and migration and migrant justice without the entanglements of the border with Indigenous sovereignty. And the ways in which the border denies, very tangibly denies, Indigenous jurisdiction and cleaves Indigenous nations by the imposition of a border, the ways in which bordering regimes like reserves are meant to contain and immobilize Indigenous peoples and deny Indigenous peoples from exercising Indigenous nationhood. And here I'm thinking of the work of the late great Secwepemc leader Arthur Manuel and his assertion that, particularly in Canada, reserves are sites of carceral containment, of deliberate impoverishment and denial of Indigenous sovereignty, and that Indigenous peoples are forced onto reserves that make up less than 0.2% of their land base, while Canada continues to benefit from the theft and dispossession of Indigenous lands. And currently, where I reside in the province of so-called BC, the Wet'suwet'en Nation continues to struggle against the Coastal GasLink pipeline and the invasion by the RCMP, the continued denial and exercise of their sovereignty on their Yinta. And so, these these affirmations of land and land acknowledgements are not, of course, as we know, exercises, performative exercises, but really that these are live struggles that take so many forms, that demand and command our solidarity, and to think alongside and to prioritize Indigenous struggles, struggles for land back, struggles against resource extraction, struggles against gendered violence, and so much more. And movements that I've been involved in, particularly No One is Illegal, one of the things that we would always say is no one is illegal, Canada is illegal. And in this way, migrant justice and Indigenous sovereignty are not contradictions, but I think are really constituted through each other, that these forms of justice are constituted through each other with deep entanglements in how the settler state was formed and how racial capitalism operates, and of course, all within a global web of empire. And so I think this is so necessary to thinking about really the political economy of stolen labor on stolen land, right? That's really what we're talking about, is stolen labor on stolen land. The things that I want to speak about today are going to focus on really three main things, which is the language of immigration and migration, if you will, really what that means in the context of the world, to really try to take it apart from the very kind of Canadian context, but to think about it in a global scale, and then to think about it alongside and how it's necessarily part of racial capitalism. And so the first thing that I want to think about is language, because language is so central to how we understand and frame issues, and of course is constantly evolving. And one of the things that I'm deeply thoughtful about, as I know many other people are as well, is how the migration crisis needs to be reframed, right? And that the global migration crisis is, I think, more accurately described as a crisis of displacement and immobility. And the emphasis on displacement here forces us to interrogate the root causes of conquest and capitalism and climate change that are the real culprits and drivers of displacement. And further, when we say migration crisis, when we hear it in mainstream media, we tend to assume that most people are actually able to move in the search of safety or work, and under conditions that are, somewhat free, if you will. And we tend to assume that most people can actually move, right? But in fact, most people are immobilized. Despite the constant border panics blasted, particularly by Western media, 95% of forcibly displaced people around the world remain internally displaced or in refugee camps in neighboring countries. Most researchers who work on issues of migration and displacement, I should say, I'm not an academic, I'm not a scholar, but really the good work of those who work on this in the academia consistently show that less than 1% of refugees living in refugee camps, for example, around the world, ever find a permanent home in a different country. Most people are not able to move under conditions of what we would consider free movement, because border controls are deadly. And most people are being contained at border sites and refugee camps through state processes of interdiction, pushbacks, restricted visa requirements, smart borders, et cetera, et cetera. So I think reframing the migration crisis as a displacement and immobility crisis illuminates that most migrants are forcibly displaced and systematically immobilized. And so displacement and immobility then, not free movement, is the reality of racial imperial management in our contemporary era. In this sense, borders are carceral regimes. Police and prisons and borders all operate by immobilizing people caught in their crosshairs. In doing research for the book, one of the things that I found really fascinating, and it may seem like a minor point, but I found really fascinating, was that the root of the word mob, so the mob, M-O-B, a kind of criminalizing vocabulary that is often used to link large groups of poor racialized people to social disorder in inner cities and at the border, derives from the word mobility, right? And so here, mobility is so critical to the criminalization of itself. And so Angela Davis and Gina Dent, in a piece in the early 2000s, and Angela Davis and Gina Dent being, of course, some of the foremost abolitionist thinkers in North America, in a piece in the early 2000s when they were writing about prisons, they wrote, quote, "We continue to find that the prison is itself a border," end quote. And here, I think if we are to draw on Angela Davis and Gina Dent, we can say that the prison is a border and the border is a prison, because the border is at once domestic and global. And we can see that a world without police, prisons, private property, militaries, and borders is a necessarily interconnected horizon of freedom. The second thing I want to note about language is that language such as migrant crisis or refugee crisis or border crisis is often a pretext to shore up further border securitization and repressive practices of detention and deportation. So images and language of swarms, floods, caravans, invaders, all depict and villainize migrants and refugees as the cause of a border crisis. Whenever the state claims a crisis, we know that its responses end up in service to the state and reconfigurations of state power, not those who are actually impacted and who are bearing the brunt of the so-called crisis. And so in the same way, we see this, for example, in passive language of border deaths and smuggling and trafficking, right? So whenever the state says, oh, we need to resolve this crisis of border deaths or the crisis of smuggling and trafficking, the actual response is that the state gets to launder violent state responses such as interdiction, interception, drone surveillance, and detention as so-called rescue. And here, without going into much detail, I just want to shout out the really important local Toronto work of Butterfly. Butterfly is an Asian and migrant sex worker support network who does so much work to untangle the ways in which, when the state claims crises, particularly for migrant sex workers under the guise of smuggling and trafficking, how much more harm that does and how it actually reconfigures immigration controls to further surveillance and control migrant sex workers. And perhaps most ironically and offensively, the migration crisis is declared a new crisis with Western countries like Canada positioned as its primary victims, even though for 4 centuries, nearly 80 million Europeans became settler colonists across the Americas and Oceania, which we know is a continuing structure, while 4 million indentured laborers from Asia were scattered across the globe, and the transatlantic slave trade kidnapped and enslaved 15 million Africans. So colonialism, genocide, slavery, and indentureship are not only completely erased as continuities of violence, again, not just historic, but ongoing continuities of violence in current invocations of a migration crisis, but are also the very conditions of possibility for Western notions of bordered sovereignty. And finally, and this is, perhaps more about semantics and language, but again, I think important nonetheless, because it, I think, gets us thinking differently, is that, when we question who is considered a migrant within the narrative of migration crisis, it really blows open the lid on global asymmetries of power and all the kinds of assumptions that we make, right? So we never talk about business travelers or expats or diplomats or vacationers as migrants, even though there are millions of people on the move today, including people Columbusing, and I use that deliberately, people who are Columbusing all around the world on luxury yachts, people hopping on airplanes in first class every week, people with investor class immigrant visas. That kind of movement is not surveilled or scapegoated or scrutinized or considered problematic at all. In fact, under our system of colonialism and capitalism, that kind of movement representing power and the dominant race, class, caste, settler status, and empire is actually celebrated and sought after, right? So gentrifiers, for example, are often lauded as the new pioneers, usurping land and property and building gated communities enforced through policing and displacement of homeless encampments. In the province where I reside in BC, the actual, until recently being about a decade ago, statistically, the highest number of people who had overstayed their visas in the province of BC for several years was actually white Australians, right? Many who had overstayed their visas either or who were working quote unquote illegally. And I'm not saying that to reinforce any of that language, but it really points out how racialized debates about immigration is, right? When we're talking again about immigration and migration, it is already inherently raced and classed and more, because the invocation of who is an immigrant, right? The eternal hyphenated citizen, the Asian Canadian, on and on and on, constantly places particular communities as always being outsiders, right? It has very little to do with one's actual legal status. It has to do with being placed as constant outsiders. And again, of course, in different ways, because there's so many ways in which that is marked. While, of course, completely displacing Indigenous peoples from lands while centering Europeans, settler Europeans, as somehow the hosts, right, who are going to welcome immigrants. So the ways in which we talk about who belongs where, who's an immigrant, who belongs, whether Europeans are considered immigrants or not, or even considered settlers or not, is completely evaded in talks about immigration. And so we have to recognize that conversations about immigration, about refugees, about migrant workers, about undocumented people are always deeply coded across race, class, gender, and more, and are never neutral and are never simply conversations about law and order, if you will. And so when we say migration crisis, we aren't actually talking about any and all kinds of movement or any person on the move. In fact, embedded in the language of migration crisis is the anti-Black idea of a certain kind of inherently undesirable movement, the unregulated, ungovernable movement of predominantly racialized, poor, and oppressed people. Contemporary immigration enforcement draws heavily from the foundational terror of anti-Black violence, particularly the regulation of Black movement. And Ronaldo Walcott and Idil Abdullahi in their recent book write that, quote, movements that we now call migration are founded in anti-Blackness, taking their logic from transatlantic slavery, end quote. And here, of course, Robin Maynard's incredible depth of work and breadth of work is incredibly instructive here as well. And when the state and mainstream media invoke a migration crisis, then it is not all movement or any and all kind of people who are crossing borders who they have in mind, but rather it is specifically displaced and immobilized people on the other side of whiteness, on the other side of capital, on the other side of empire, who are being dehumanized, who are being contained, and who are being surveillanced and captured by carceral systems and borders. So I think all of that is so necessary to situate the context for how we think and talk about immigration issues. The other thing, and the next thing that I want to talk about, moving away from language in this kind of broader context, is to think about imperialism. Because a lot of times, particularly in Canada, we're really pigeonholed into very domesticated conversations about immigration, right? So on the right, we have discussions that are so blatantly exclusionary, right? Here thinking of Erin O'Toole and others, or the far right, that are blatantly racist, blatantly white supremacist, blatantly exclusionary. But then we have the kind of liberal center, where we are told immigrants are quote unquote good for the economy, or refugees welcome, all of which still perpetuate a kind of humanitarian benevolence, charity, multiculturalism, right? That kind of myth and logic, which again still centers whiteness, still requires and builds upon and facilitates capital accumulation. But really, if we're thinking globally, and again, if we're thinking about the root causes of displacement, then we need to move. We need to move from thinking about immigration just as a domestic issue and an issue of quotas or how many is too many, or these kinds of questions, to thinking about the world, to thinking about reparations, to thinking about the asymmetries of global power. And I want to do that in two ways. One is by talking about imperialism, and the second is by talking about racial capitalism. So as we know, I won't go into much detail. Imperialism, conquest, capitalism, climate change, and mass global inequities of many forms is a root cause of global displacement, right? The total number of migrants continues to increase worldwide. And here, of course, migrants means many things depending on which study you're looking at. But most estimate that it's reached over 272 million people, which is 3.5% of the world's population. And of that number, 70.8 million are forcibly displaced people. Palestinians, for example, are considered the world's most protracted refugee population, with 5.5 million Palestinians in refugee camps. This can, of course, be traced back to 1948, when Zionist paramilitaries conquered Palestinian territories. Zionist paramilitaries conquered Palestinian territories and the ongoing apartheid and occupation of Palestine. Climate change is also now one of the fastest growing forms of displacement. In 2016, new displacements caused by climate disasters outnumbered new displacements as a result of persecution by a ratio of 3 to 1. By 2050, an estimated 143 million people will be displaced in just 3 regions of the world, with some projections for global climate displacement ranging as high as 1 billion people. And of course, we know that not all people are equally responsible for climate change. We know that just 100 companies are overwhelmingly responsible for over 70% of global emissions. We know that Indigenous communities, rural communities, peasant communities, coastal communities, farming communities are going to be most impacted by changes in climate change and are on the front lines of defending against climate change around the world. Indigenous peoples steward 80% of the world's biodiversity, right? So we know that, again, these kinds of global inequities are not only caused disproportionately by global forces, but the fault lines of who is impacted mimic the fault lines of who is displaced, right? War, militarization, free trade agreements, extraction zones, all of these are the same fault lines of displacement that are the same fault lines of migration, that are the same fault lines of immobility. And here it is important to note that many migrants and refugees who are being displaced as a result of all of these different kinds of forces are also Indigenous and Black people, which is importantly not mutually exclusive. A large proportion of Central American and Mexican migrants and refugees to Canada and the US are Indigenous. A huge number of migrants and refugees that are increasingly in news stories who are trapped in Mexico are from Haiti and from the African continent, many of whom are now organizing through the Assembly of African Migrants. And the formulation of the Black Mediterranean in Europe locates murderous European border policies in the material relations and roots of anti-Blackness. And here, returning again, to the point I was making earlier, so much of this migration is a result of ongoing colonialism and imperial displacements, underwritten by anti-Indigenous and anti-Black violence, whether it's military occupations, land thefts, resource extraction, capitalist trade agreements, labor exploitation, or climate change. And as the late, great Stuart Hall put it, quote, "Migration is increasingly the joker in the globalization pack," end quote. And so we can understand migration as both an act of individual self-determination and as an expression of decolonial reparations and redistribution long overdue. The main point that I actually want to make with respect to thinking about imperialism is actually a second one, which is that imperialism is increasingly a pillar of global migration and the management of global migration, and particularly the outsourcing of border controls is becoming a primary means of preserving imperial relations. US, Canada, Australia, and Europe, and these countries like the US, Australia, Canada, and Europe, the subordination of other countries, like for example, countries in Central America, in the Oceania, in Africa, and the Middle East, has increasingly compelled countries in the global South to accept external border checkpoints, offshore detention, migration prevention campaigns, and expel deportees as conditions of trade and aid agreements. It is actually countries in the global South, countries like Libya, Mali, Mexico, Nauru, Niger, Papua New Guinea, Turkey, and Sudan that have become the new frontiers of border militarization. And this is incredibly important because a lot of times when we're thinking about the border and we're thinking about migrant justice, we're often just thinking about, again, what's happening within our so-called borders, what's happening at the border or what's happening within our so-called borders. But increasingly borders are being outsourced, right? So the border is multiplying, it is being outsourced. And imperialism is the method by which borders are being outsourced. In the United States, for example, Customs and Border Protection has trained 15,000 border agents from 100 different countries. Todd Miller, who writes in the United States, remarks, quote, "Close your eyes and point to any landmass on a world map, and your finger will probably find a country that is building up its borders in some way with Washington's assistance," end quote. So all of the horrors that have been unfolding under previous President Trump's Remain in Mexico protocols, or that we see now under President Biden, is a result of border outsourcing, right? It's not an anomaly. It's a pattern of outsourcing the border. And the United States, for example, their Department of Homeland Security has consistently said, that our border is no longer the southern border with Mexico. Our southern border is now the border with Guatemala, right? So the US benefits from outsourcing its border in a multitude of ways. Other countries do its dirty work. Other countries continue to be held within the matrix of imperial relations. And whenever there are court cases for which the United States would need to be held liable, it can actually say we're not culpable, right? This is a third country that is responsible. And this is not just the United States. This is also Canada. This is also Australia. This is also increasingly the European Union. So this method of outsourcing is increasingly the method of border securitization. Europe has similarly constructed an entire fortress around itself that extends far beyond the borders of Europe. Countries across the Sahel region in Africa are especially pressured to accept outsourcing of EU borders. The EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa diverts billions of euros that are supposed to be earmarked for aid to 26 African countries, and now diverts all of that money into surveillance and military equipment to prevent refugees from leaving the continent. Frontex is expanding its patrols and interceptions in the Mediterranean. It's already the world's deadliest border. And now EU development, trade, and aid agreements require African countries to implement border checkpoints and migration prevention campaigns in order to receive aid money. So what can we take from all this? There's so many more examples I could give, but what we can take is two things, I think. First, that borders, including, when we're thinking about Canada, borders are not fixed lines simply demarcating territory. Borders are productive regimes firmly embedded in global imperialism, and border controls exist far beyond the territorial border itself. So I think we need to be paying more attention, in particular, to how the outsourcing of border controls is increasingly a method of maintaining imperial superpower in the world, especially for US, Canada, Israel, India, Australia, New Zealand, UK, and Western and Central EU countries. And second is we have to understand how critical immigration-related diplomacy is to current global relations. Immigration diplomacy through the soft power of aid agreements, or in some cases, outright threats of trade war, has compelled countries across Africa, across Latin America, across the Middle East, across Asia, across Oceania, to accept outsourced migration controls, all of which cements imperial relations, maintains a colonial presence, and globalizes the violence of borders. The third thing that I wanted to talk about is, again, thinking expansively and thinking globally, is about racial capitalism. And here in the framing of racial capitalism that I draw on is rooted in the works of Cedric Robinson, Neville Alexander, Robin D.G. Kelley, Angela Davis, and the larger Black Marxist tradition. Cedric Robinson theorized the linkage between racial expropriation and capitalism as racial capitalism, so as to make clear that the social construction and the real differentiation of race is not a secondary outcome of capitalism, but rather that racism is constitutive of capitalism. So what is crucial here is that the racial expropriation of land, labor, and life itself is innate to capitalism. Capitalism relies on, requires, and reproduces racial hierarchies. In that sense, there can be no capitalism, no anti-capitalism that is not also anti-racist. And there can be no anti-racism that is not also anti-capitalist for either of them to be meaningful. Capitalism does not produce a universal relation of wage to labor. Racism is a material structure that is foundational to labor exploitation, to conquest, to territorial expansion, to dispossession, to enslavement, to corporate ownership, to surveillance, to bordering regimes, and to the entire maintenance of the so-called global north vis-a-vis the global south. And of course, within that, the global south within the global north, and the global north within the global south. And of course, adding to that, we know that capitalism is not only racialized, it is also gendered and ableist and so much more. The growing global reliance on migrant workers, in particular, demonstrates both the centrality of bordering regimes to racial capitalism, as well as the failure of many left nationalist positions. And I want to kind of end on these pieces. So first, just 2 points of clarification. What I mean by migrant workers now when I'm talking is not all people who migrate for work, but rather those workers under state-sanctioned programs of temporary migrant work. Low wage and temporary migrant workers are tied, many would say indentured, to one employer by contracts and visas, are subjected to dangerous working conditions, forced labor, wage theft, and are denied access to labor protection, social services, and full immigration status. In Canada, this has historically been, in particular, domestic workers and agricultural farm workers, right? There are many other categories under the TFWP, but that really has been the central space and place of struggle, particularly for 40 years when these programs, or more than 40 years now, since the 60s, when these programs were instituted in many forms in their current formation, really. But here I'm thinking globally as well. And secondly, I just want to be clear, when I mean that the left nationalist position has failed, I want to be clear, I don't mean oppressed people's struggles for national liberation, but specifically the position held by some, particularly here in Canada, that the form of the nation state can guard against the ills of globalized neoliberal capitalism. The left nationalist position maintains that the state has been captured by multinational corporations and has withered away under capitalist globalization. So that's a claim that many make. I'm going to be returning to it. I just want to start by being clear what I mean by terminology. So in the case of migrant workers, and again, globally, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the specifics within Canada, their distinct ordering of legal but deportable labor generates structural hierarchies between racialized migrant workers and citizen workers. And that really affixes race to citizenship. This is not a question of just bad employers, even though the media would sometimes have us think that it's just a question of a few bad employers. But of course, we know this is not just a question of bad employers, right? This is the actual state-sanctioned this is state-sanctioned violence. This is a state-sanctioned legal program of exploitation. And that is really relies on the border and relies on the nation state, because it is bordering regimes that facilitate the segmentation of certain workers as migrant workers. There is an entire class of workers who, even though they are our neighbors in the same workforce as us, they're suddenly in a different position in the labor force and in the nation state with completely different rights and entitlements, who fall under completely different programs. So how does this happen? Precisely through the border. Migration has been controlled by borders in order to both create an imperial racial regime of terror, as I talked about earlier, through detention and interdiction and deportation and more, as well as to produce pliable labor segmented by nationality and race. The border then acts as a spatial fix for capitalism, following David Harvey's work, and is a key pillar of both globalized racial capitalism and racist citizenship. Capitalism requires labor to be constantly segmented and differentiated. We know this, right? Whether it's across race, gender, ability, caste, and then we add citizenship to that mix. These stratifications cheapen labor, because there is no such thing as cheap labor. It is the conditions of capitalism and other forms of manufactured vulnerability that create cheapened labor. Lack of full and permanent immigration status is so key to creating pools of hyper-exploitable cheapened labor. Migrant workers then is essentially a euphemism for third world workers. Jobs like farm work, domestic work, service work that cannot be outsourced to the so-called third world are now being insourced. So insourcing and outsourcing represent two sides of the same capitalist coin. Deliberately deflated labor and political power. And so here I would argue, importantly, coming back to the left nationalist position, that the state has not actually withered away under capitalism. While austerity certainly means a weakened public sector, the financial and carceral arms of the state that guarantee capital flows, that maintain social control of people, have actually expanded. We see this, rising budgets for the military, rising budgets for the police, rising budgets for immigration enforcement, rising budgets for prisons, rising budgets for CSIS to spy on land offenders. This is all expanding, it's not withering away. And so in this way, the state has not withered away under capitalism. And borders are not intended to exclude all people or to deport all people, but to create conditions of deportability, which in turn increases social and labor precarity. It is necessary to understand how central migrant workers are to racial capitalism, because it shows us that the border actually works in the interests of capital and not against it. And this is precisely why left nationalists and some, and some unions, some labor unions, not all, are wrong when they have a misdirected approach to say, for example, shut down the border or Canadian jobs for Canadian workers only. This is not only a racist approach, it is also a misdirected approach. In this formulation, migrant workers are essentially scab workers who are lowering the wage floor and stealing jobs from citizens. But migrant workers don't suppress wages, bosses and borders do. Free capital requires immobilized labor that the border produces. And also, for migrants to be pitted against so-called citizen workers in this way presupposes that migrants are not also workers participating and leading class struggles. So we can see how this kind of purportedly left nationalism can dovetail perfectly with right-wing and bourgeois nationalism by increasing immigration enforcement, by reproducing the logic of scarcity and scapegoating that austerity depends on. It blunts class consciousness and maintains the international division of labor upon which capitalism relies. This is why it is so important for left movements to take up the call for status for all workers, as put forward by migrant worker organizations themselves. Here within Canada, the work of MWAC, Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, and all of the organizations that they represent. And I see that Ethel is on this call, the amazing work that Ethel and so many others have been doing to really put forward the demands of migrant workers, which is that migrant workers should have immigration status, the right to collectively organize and unionize, full rights to labor protections, full health and safety protections. The only way to fight back against the cheapening of labor is to engage in an internationalist fight against racist citizenship and racial capitalism, which is to say for immigration status and for labor protections and for living wages for all workers, and to make the divisions created by the border effectively obsolete. I want to conclude by offering what I think migrant justice movements effectively means, and that is a no border politics. And a lot of times when people hear of a no border politics, it can sound frightening, it can sound utopic, but of course revolutionary politics always is utopic, or it can sound unappealing. And oftentimes when people think of a no border politics, they're actually thinking of an open border politics, right? Which is that the world stays the same, the world remains as is, and that we open up the border, which raises questions like, oh, but if you got rid of the border, everyone will come here, or what about a brain drain, and all of these kinds of things. But a no border politics is not only about opening the border and having the world remain as is. And here, thinking alongside organizations like Le Gilet Noir in Europe, Mi Gente, No One Is Legal, the Sans Papier movement in Europe, and so many other grassroots movements, opening the border isn't enough if we still have mass inequality and social differentiation around the world. A no border politics is more expansive than the site of the border itself. A no border politics is about dismantling all bordering, all ordering, and all exploitative regimes. We have to dismantle all the systems that uphold a system of apartheid that even allows the global north to exist in relationship to the global south, or the conditions of the south within the north. We have to eradicate the asymmetrical reality of who is displaced and who is forced to move and under what conditions. We need to fundamentally change this world. It means no more military occupations, no more prisons, no more police, no more borders, no more drone warfare, no more sweatshops, no more corporations, no more banks. This is all part of the revolutionary horizon that we need. A no border politics then is expansive. It excludes the freedom to stay and the freedom to move, meaning that no one should be forcibly displaced from their homes and their lands, and that people should have the freedom to move with safety and dignity. This may seem contradictory, but these are actually necessary corollaries. The crux of a no border politics, I think, is nestled in the broader politics of home. How do we create a world where we all have a home, where we can all claim home, where we are all at home in our bodies, where the earth is cared for as a home, where non-human beings have a home? And thinking of home is not a sentimental matter, right? At the edge of climate catastrophe, it is a pressing political issue. And so I want to close with the prophetic words of Toni Morrison. She says, quote, "In this new space, one can imagine safety without walls, can iterate difference that is prized but unprivileged, and conceive of a third, if you will pardon the expression, world, already made for me, both snug and wide open, with a doorway never needing to be closed, home," end quote. Thank you all. Thank you all so much for listening, and I look forward to being in conversation.
Thank you very much, Harsha. You've given us a lot to think about. I've just been here furiously taking notes for my own purposes, but also to be a good moderator. And you've made me think of a lot of personal experiences I've had in the labor movements, but also about questions I've asked in my own research. So I think it's very fitting that you end with this idea of home and the meaning around that. because first I want to talk about my own research. Again, I don't want to be the cliche academic, but in my dissertation research, I actually asked the question of why do young Indigenous adults choose to leave home based on school and work decisions. And I asked this question in the context of my community, which is within the oil sands region. So you could stay home and work in the oil industry, which was exploitive, or you could leave for an education, and you had to make this decision when you were a teenager, basically, to leave home to get an education, to work in other industries besides resource extraction. And people chose to make homes where they chose to make family, where they had opportunities of school and work. And what I found in my research was that, in Canada, under the Indian Act, First Nations and Métis people had access to different policies. So First Nations people could leave home if they had Indian status, and there was programs specifically for them, whereas my Métis and non-status community members weren't as freely to move. But then when I looked at the demographics of Indigenous migrants to urban areas, where I was doing my research in Alberta, in Edmonton and places like Calgary, there was more second and third generation Métis migrants that lived in urban centers. And in urban centers, we were just starting to get our first generation of First Nations migrants to urban centers. And so, as you talk about border imperialism and Canada's colonial capitalist history, I think of how the Indian Act actually plays into that history very well, not just keeping us on reserves, but keeping us out of urban areas. And one of the questions I asked people in my community when I interviewed them was, well, where do you feel you belong? Where's home to you? And do you feel you have a right to live anywhere? And they all said, yeah, this is all of our land. This is our traditional territory. We should be able to freely move between the reserve and the city. And they all felt that way, that this was all of our land. It was stolen land, so we should have this right. However, when I looked at labor and training policies, educational policies, when I looked at the labor market, Indigenous people can't really move that freely. It was people who had, in my community, that were middle class that could move to urban centers and get a better education and therefore get better work. So it was very class-based, it was very gender-based. Indigenous men could work in resource extraction more likely. Indigenous women ended up getting more educated in order for them to have more mobility as migrants, but also as workers. You have greater mobility the more education you have and the more upper class that you are. So yeah, your talk really made me think about the borders around within Canada. But also, I guess to get to my questions that I wanted to ask, I thought about some things. I even think about the introduction from the Eleen family that we had, that they made a great life for themselves in rural Ontario. And that's something that not all workers and migrants and people can do today. And so I think your discussion is very important for this specific lecture. But when I was doing my research and wanting to talk to Indigenous oil field workers, I spoke to other researchers who had been talking to racialized and temporary foreign workers and care workers in the oil industry. And we had this funny discussion where a research colleague of mine said, well, have you noticed there's no love loss between temporary foreign workers, specifically like Filipino workers and the Indigenous workers here, because both of their employers, she surmised, were feeding them racist ideologies. The Filipino workers were told, don't go around the Indigenous people. They'll get drunk and beat you up. They're very violent, and they're lazy workers. The Indigenous workers were told, you know, we can't trust temporary foreign workers. They're here as settlers to steal our jobs. We can't even get jobs in this region, yet they're bringing people here. So this global capitalist system of race-based labor ends up creating these frictions on the ground. And really, we're all on the same side. We are all being exploited, and in my region of the country, by these large multinational corporations. We're being exploited by the government of Canada, who has these TFW programs, who doesn't, you know, make proper agreements with Indigenous communities for us to have more work. So, you know, and the question I had leading to this was, you know, how can regular working class Indigenous peoples be better allies? Because, you know, it's one thing for Indigenous land defenders to fully understand this global system and to already understand this exploitation of the land and of workers. But I think for regular working class folks in Northern Canadian communities where most of the jobs are in resource extraction, like how can we get those people to be good allies? Or do they need to be good allies? Like what can we do with those relations?
Thank you for that question. And it actually, for all of that, and it where you ended actually reminds me in Northern BC, of course, very different than Northern Alberta, but the similarities perhaps is jobs in resource extraction, particularly in the 80s and 90s, or even earlier, 70s, 80s, and 90s in the lumber mills, right? A lot of resource extractive jobs in the mills. And there was and at that time, predominantly Punjabi workers, not migrant workers, but immigrant workers, who also predominantly worked in the farms. But going back to Northern BC, the lumber mills with Punjabi workers and a lot of Indigenous workers. And just hearing you talk about some of those divisions, of course, resonates in many other sectors as well, right? So hearing a lot about different forms of racism and anti-Indigenous racism that Punjabi workers would be fed by employers and also by the state in general, and also, of course, recognizing, you know, the position of immigrants within the settler state and the kinds of things, exactly as you said, that Indigenous workers were told about Punjabi workers, which is that, look, you know, we can't even get jobs, and here are foreigners coming and taking our jobs. So very similar dynamics. And I think it really was through, in their case, from everything that I know and that I know of through my kids' family, is it really was the joint struggle of unionizing, actually, that brought them together. And there is now a word in Punjabi that only exists in Northern BC. It is a Punjabi word whose entire etymology, is that the word? I don't know, but like language root, is based in Northern BC, and that word is taike. And the word taike loosely translates, it's a specific Punjabi dialect, and it loosely translates to my father's older brother's relatives. And taike is the word that in the course of unionizing in Northern BC, that Punjabi people started to use to refer to Indigenous peoples as. So I use that as an example of how it shifted the struggle of unionizing together, of finding ways to be in relationship together. Fishing was actually another one. People came together to fish, and just food security, right? Knowing that people, and a lot of Punjabis, and people may know right now, for example, the farmers' protests are going on, right? Like a lot of Punjabis come from the context of agriculture, not necessarily fishing, but really strong belief in food sovereignty and food security and tending to the land. and so took on practices of fishing that were taught to them by Indigenous fishers and Indigenous people who were fishing. And so both that and the struggle with in the place of employment and against the employer and unionizing, actually, not to romanticize it, but led to relationships and co-resistance that actually formulated a new vocabulary. Like there's something so incredible about that. And a vocabulary of kinship, right? Of referring to Indigenous peoples that you're in relationship to as your father's elder brother. There's a reverence and a respect there. And again, not to romanticize it at all. But I offer that because what you said reminded me of those possibilities and very much a similar terrain of struggle in resource extraction. And as we know, all of the complexities of being opposed to, resource extraction for all the reasons and the very lived material struggles that people face, right? And the sectors that they may be working in. And so how to do that while at the same time you're tending to the land and fishing, right? As you recognize that the land is being destroyed, like holding all of that nuance. So I'm thinking about that. The other things that you said, if I can just briefly riff off of, when you were talking about non-status people, Indigenous peoples who were non-status, I actually remember when I first heard about that. I didn't grow up on these lands, and when I first started hearing about, when I moved here, immigrated here, and heard and learned from Ellen Gabriel about the fact that Indigenous peoples can be made non-status, right, through all of the iterations of the Indian Act and the specific gendered ways in which status was taken. For me, I was like, whoa, that is, that's wild, because there's non-status migrants who have crossed borders who are made non-status because of immigration laws. And the Indian Act has made Indigenous peoples non-status. And again, it's not the same struggle, but the state is acting in very similar ways to create hierarchies of citizenship, right? Like there's something there, but materially it means something as well, which is that in Vancouver, there's a number of health clinics who provide services to non-status migrants. And when I was organizing in No One Is Legal and working alongside and organizing alongside a number of Indigenous land defenders whose kids were non-status, and also a number of land defenders who did not want to register their children under the Indian Act and didn't want their children to have birth certificates. Their kids were basically non-status, did not have access to dental benefits. And then they started accessing health clinics that were basically sanctuary clinics for non-status migrants as Indigenous peoples. And the relationships that were built in that context are also quite profound. And again, without romanticizing it, but the ways in which the state then determines what you have access to and what you don't have access to can create these spaces of, again, of coexistence and co-resistance, right? And so I was reminded of that specifically when you said non-status, because there's this health clinic now that provides health services to non-status migrants and Indigenous peoples who, for various reasons, either because they're non-status or have not registered their children, are accessing the service. And also, as you said, right, the many ways in which I've worked in the downtown east side for almost 20 years and would constantly hear the refrain, and again, the parallels and the synergies about being refugees or migrants on our own land, right? And what does it mean to be homeless on your own land? There's something incredibly profound in those kinds of statements. And so I'm thinking about all of that, but in terms of, I hope that question about, yeah, exactly as you said, how do we work against these race-based, deliberately race-based labor divisions? I think it really is, it is through struggle, right? It's through struggle, it's through co-learning, it's through breaking down the kinds of stereotypes that the enemy, the state and capital, relies on for us to be a part and to come together again in ways that are not just like we're all the same, but are attentive to the ways in which our struggles are different, or how we might be complicit in each other's struggles or in each other's injustices, right? And to always be thoughtful about that. And maybe what I'll end with is, the ever-inspiring Wobblies, right? The ever-inspiring Wobblies who brought together Indigenous workers, migrant workers. Some of the locals of the IWW in Vancouver were Indigenous and migrant-led. And so the ways in which we can use that history to revive our present struggles as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. You again make me think of a lot of my experiences of working in the labor movement. At times when I was very eager to not only, you know, fight for workers' rights, but fight against racism and discrimination in the workplace. But there was times when I was working in the labor movement where we couldn't really talk about race, where the focus was, you know, to improve wages and to improve working conditions. And so, you know, there was times when I worked in the labor movement where I would secretly meet with other racialized workers in the movement to try to organize around dealing with racism in the workplace. And the denial that some labor leaders had about this racism that was all around us was really hard at times. But what was really inspiring was some of these workers that were members of the public sector union I worked for actually came to Canada as healthcare workers. And then they were now unionized public sector workers in Canada. And they came from places where they weren't allowed to unionize. So initially they were scared about organizing, but once they joined the movement, they were some of our loudest voices. But even still, there is, you know, those racial divisions within the movement. I don't think I'm leading to a question at this point. And
that's okay. That's a necessary comment. Thank you.
Yeah. I just, you know, my other question was about how can we do better in the labor movement? And I think for me to answer that, I would say we need to have more union leaders that are racialized workers, and also Indigenous workers. So I'm answering my own question. I don't know if you want to comment on that. I've had terrible experiences in the labor movement. But I've also had very wonderful experiences of solidarity and friendship and support. So I'm just going to leave it at that. I think at this point, do you have anything else to say before we move to the questions of the audience?
Sure, maybe I can speak a little bit to that, and just first thank you for the honesty there. You know, a lot of times this is, as you probably know, in the union movement, behind closed doors. I was active in the union movement for several years, was involved in my union. And I think maybe a few things in terms of, you know, what can the union movement do? I mean, I'm sure there's so many more, but off the top of my head, I mean, I think one really is, you know, like the union movement recognizes that the sphere of the union movement is racialized women, right? Racialized women are overwhelmingly workers, are overwhelmingly the sphere of those who are in low wage work in particular, or precarious work. You know, the feminization and racialization of poverty works together in particular ways, and that includes, you know, especially migrant and Indigenous women workers. So it can recognize that, but of course doesn't recognize the magnitude of that. And by that I mean, you know, a few things. One is the magnitude of what does it mean to be experiencing that in the workplace, right? So that it's not only, of course, it's the struggle to unionize, but the struggle in the workplace includes, you know, your whole self, right? Like your dignity in the workplace. And I found in my union that was for a long time really hard to get across. It was very much about finding unity with other workers, which is very necessary, but also the ways in which you deal with the daily racism by your employer is something that is unique to racialized workers, for example, and that has to be tended to. I think the other thing is that a lot of struggles are seen as social struggles that are outside the realm of labor, right? So struggles, for example, for childcare, struggles for housing security, struggles against landlords, struggles against policing violence. Like these are not traditionally not being seen as class struggles by the labor movement. Class struggle has been seen as contained by the workplace, when in fact there is no doubt that struggles against evictions, for example, and against rent increases are squarely class struggles. Struggles against the cops are squarely class struggles because police are protectors and enforcers of capital, right? And so all of these have typically been seen as outside the purview by big labor. And that's a mistake, right? Because it means that so much of the ways in which we live are not taken up by the labor movement. The third thing I would say is that some of the demands that are coming, you know, for example, from migrant worker organizations like Status for All, like, you know, labor protections for all, have only recently been taken up by big labor, right? Because those are not seen as constituents within the House of Labor. And similarly, you know, the call by Indigenous land defenders to recognize blockades as picket lines, right? Blockades are generative forms of labor. They're an assertion of an Indigenous way of life. In my view, they are a form of generative labor. And for labor to recognize that you don't cross a blockade because you don't cross a picket line, right? So to understand labor in this expansive way, that's solid, that instead of reinforcing that kind of tired old trope of Indigenous people versus workers, as if though Indigenous people are not also workers, or as if though Indigenous land defense is not also a form of work, like to overcome that by affirming that unions will not cross blockades because they recognize those as picket lines. Unions have failed to do that, right? Despite calls by land defenders to build solidarity with unions by saying, listen, our blockade is a picket line, don't cross it, right? So unions have also failed to take up, I think, these salient kind of struggles that could really expand how we understand class struggle, that could expand the role of unions in social movements, right? To take up calls by sex workers, for example, to recognize sex workers' work, like all of that is something that I think the labor movement could be doing, in addition to, you know, the bigger question of moving away from, you know, business and service unionism to actual practices of solidarity and struggle.
Yeah. You made me think of one lesson that I always used to give. I used to also work on the employer side in labor. So I've worked for both the employer and the union in labor relations. And one lesson that I always gave management, but lesson that I always gave union leaders in training on conflict management was that just because I'm practicing my human rights and you're practicing your human rights doesn't mean that I'm infringing on your rights. So, you know, if I'm discriminated against because I'm a woman and I file a grievance or I fight for that equality, that doesn't mean that your rights as a disabled worker or an LGBTQ worker, if you fight for those rights and we're both fighting for our rights, that doesn't mean that we're fighting against each other. When we all fight for our rights together, it benefits us all. And that was a lesson that I felt like I was constantly teaching, because even people who worked side by side didn't realize that they were sometimes fighting the same employer or profit-based system. And so I think that's something that you make me think about as well. Yeah, I always remember I was doing training for the union, and one union member said, but don't you think human rights has gone too far? Aren't women asking for too much? Aren't Indigenous people asking for too much? This is too much. If we accommodate everybody, then nobody's going to get anything done. And I said, well, if we accommodate everybody, then we'll all be treated better and work better. And so, you know, you make me think about those human rights discussions I've had to have on very practical levels. I'm going to end on a funny note. A couple of years ago, I was traveling from Madrid to Belgium. And I saw the funniest interaction where there was Americans behind me getting very upset because in Europe, if you have a EU passport, you just go through the system very quickly. Whereas if you're not from the EU, there's several more checkpoints for you. So if you're North American or you're from Africa, where a lot of the people there were from, you have to stop and wait much longer. So just to watch that funny interaction with Americans getting, especially it was these two white male Americans behind me who were just extremely upset by the whole process. And I thought, oh, this is probably the first time they haven't had that privilege of their, American citizenship, especially, and their other privileges. So yeah, these past systems are terrible, but that was something funny that I experienced at one point. Anyways, I don't know if there's any more questions. Thank you very much. I think this talk was very informative, but also inspiring for people doing work on the ground. And you do, in your writing, but also in your lecture today, you do this amazing thing where you weave together all of these concepts and policies and laws and theories and experiences of racialized and marginalized people together very well. I think it's just it's really great to bring together all these complexities in the way that you do, to bring together imperialism and borders and capitalism and labor. It's just amazing work that you do, and yeah, I can see connections all over the place, and I'd love to talk to you for hours and hours more, but we only have a couple minutes left. So thank you very much. It's great. I think Luann's gonna close us off.
Yeah, I'll just say very briefly another word of thanks. Harsha and Angele for a rich and challenging dialogue this afternoon. I did see a question in the chat about whether there would be a recording of the talk made available on the website, and Harsha has just noted there that yes, it will be posted on the GLRC website. Without the question, the Q&A, which was a very rich part of this exchange. I do want to thank, on behalf of everyone here today, for your generosity in your responses to the questions, both of you, your engagement with one another, and in sharing your knowledge and insight with all of us today. And thanks to each one of you that tuned in to yet another Zoom webinar and for engaging with us this afternoon. Please do check out our GLRC website and think about how you might get involved. And thank you again, and take good care, everyone.